Hello and welcome. This is a more of a podcast episode. It's more casual, not teaching. We're going to go into what's our why and a little bit about our backstory. We've just figured out it's going to be two parts. So I'm going to interview Chris, or Chris is going to share, and I'm going to deepen with some questions where I feel like there's parts that I could offer to help refine and get a sense of Chris's background and what brings him to this work and what his motivation is and what his heart's longings are. And I'm going to have him do the same for me in a second episode. And the intention behind this is really so people can understand why we're supporting people in this work in infinite intimacy and some of the containers that we guide and teach around all kinds of elements of the embodiment journey, the soul's awakening journey, the mystical and incredible and the awesome elements of life that really are some of my favorite experiences of being able to collaborate with you and to co-teach with you and just the mastery you bring and the background that you have that brings all this incredible authority. So I'm excited about this. Thanks for being willing, Chris.
Oh, thanks. And thanks for listening, everybody.
The other part is Chris is one of these people that is like so shy about all of his background and authority. And I'm like, talk about yourself a little, tell a little. And he's like, nah, let's just skip into the lesson. I'm like, okay. I've cornered him into the opportunity to share some of your, origin story, so to speak. And it's a really beautiful and incredible story. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing some of that.
Would you like me to begin, or do you have a specific question you want to
Oh,
start with?
beginning at the beginning is a cool place to start. Yeah.
Um, so for me, when we're looking at this through the lens of, I'll be kind of framing this telling in light of the arc of trying to learn to how to get in touch with one's own true desires. This is a core theme that we're noticing so much culturally, societally, in individuals' lives and what they're sharing and working with people. And so I'm kind of framing it through that lens. So that's kind of the way this is going to kind of be narrated, I suppose. So in my case, the early parts of my story in life are stories of pretty significant abandonment. And from there, the development of a survival structure and an adaptation built around needing to be of service to everyone else as a way to ensure belonging and therefore to ensure survival. So I was what people would call adopted. So I was raised in an adopted family who, as a white person in a white family or Caucasian, like nobody necessarily knew. It wasn't an obvious cross sort of ethnicity or cross racial type dynamic. Um, and I wasn't treated any differently in a to really honor my family. It was really one of the family. It was a highly knit, deeply interwoven, religious kind of tradition of a sort of ethnic group, Catholics in this case, is what I grew up, who all lived in the same neighborhood and everybody went to church together. And we went to church school together and we played in church sports leagues together. And so the whole world was really revolved around that kind of the church and religion as center of life and school and family. And we prayed in the home and I went to Catholic school and I went to high school. I went to an all-male Catholic prep school and I eventually joined a religious order and studied to be a priest. So that's a very deep um, part of the story. And sort of within that, there was a lot of sort of there's a very mixed messaging around this whole topic of being in touch with one's desires. So there was a sort of boy code or man code version of it that maybe a lot of folks might recognize, even if it didn't have necessarily a religious variation in my case, which was that clear messaging that my value as a person, as a boy, and then wanted to grow up to be a man was outside of myself. It was in achievement, it was in doing externally, and that by and large, my internal life was not highly valued or considered all that important. I personally am the kind of person who did spend a lot of time, partly that due to the fact that I was really sick a lot as a kid, so I had to spend a lot of time on my own. So I did develop a kind of inner life. It became the source of me getting like teased and made fun of and bullied and treated as weird and odd and so on. But yeah, the clear messaging was pretty clearly like value outside of oneself in the doingness, with a twist in this case, which was not to, be machismo and make a lot of money and be rich and powerful and drive around in a car or a fast car or whatever like that. It wasn't like that kind of ego gratification or consumption model. It was values outside of oneself by sacrificing yourself for the group and being either like a good father and a loyal, devoted husband kind of model, or if one wanted to be of value or service in the religious part of the community, which I spent some time exploring, then sacrificing family, sacrificing relationship life, sacrificing personal ownership. So my vows that I had for a period of my life were celibacy, poverty, and obedience. So it was very clear as I was, giving up essentially all the main worldly definitions and so on. And the motto, in fact, of my high school was "a man for others," which I've always in later life reflected on. I was like, wait a minute, literally I exist for others. Like it's obviously it seems on the surface better than a man who's only out for himself, and he'll, smash you if you get in his way, and he'll use you and either get on board or get out of the way, he'll run you over. That's not obviously a great motto either, but a man for others on the surface seemed more compassionate and empathetic and more service oriented, which it certainly was, but it had the effect of fundamentally disconnecting me from what actually did I want. So all the various layers of it kind of was a natural survival style given my experience, given that was what the social norm was. It all sort of fit hand in glove. My whole spiritual life and prayer life that I was taught was to surrender my will, not my will, but your will be done, validating kind of spiritual martyrdom and self-sacrifice, all under good auspices to be of love, to be of compassion, to be of service. And there was a lot of good in it. And there was a lot of love and care and orientation to care for the poor. And a lot of my life, which is distinct from a lot of people's experience potentially, is that I spent a lot of years in various service work and living in places that lots of people may not have experienced, and seeing life from the other side of the tracks, and having life really devoted to service. So there's a lot of beauty about that that I still look to carry forward. But there was definitely this whole underside of it, which was it was at the cost of being really true to who I was. And it was a very constrictive world ultimately. Within it, it was quite beautiful, and there was a lot of relationality and deep belonging, and in a good way, sense of like tribe in a lovely way, which a lot of people I later learned in life didn't have. But it was kind of an all or nothing proposition in the sense that in order to be a member of the group, you really had to buy into the whole ideology, the whole group doctrine or herd mentality. And I was a bit too much of a free thinker and explorer. And so that came at the cost of fitting in eventually. Yeah.
Do you remember, just to take it back to desire, do you remember your relationship to desire when it was something that you experienced in your body of like, oh, I have this like impulse, and like what was Chris's response to that experience at the time?
Well, from very early on, I I would say the earliest like really strong desires in my being that were apparent, and again, part of it was genuine, and then part of it was also this is what was socially normed. And just kind of figuring out where that line is isn't always clear, but um, I the images I had because it was such a world that was built that way, is I had images of these like, devoted husbands and dads, and then also priests. And I was like, well, why do I just be, can't I do both? And so I had these fundamental deep desires to move in both directions. And in that world, those are not copacetic. You get one or the other, very explicitly. So I struggled immensely through my teenage years and in my years in university, or what they call in the US, my college years, my undergraduate years. Um, to like I uh, it felt like I was being asked to cut off one of my arms, basically. And it was like, well, which one am I going to cut off? Um, Eventually, in a way that I didn't expect, after I left my religious order days, which was kind of in my mid 20s, I ended up moving to a different denomination within Christianity where clergy can get married, which is how I ended up going back a second time to finish seminary in my late 20s, and then was ordained as a pastor, as a priest, and spent some years in my early 30s in church work, and then had a series of dreams that suggested to me I had a choice point to make. And then I thought my life was heading in one direction, but I was invited to contemplate the possibility that it might head in another, which was the basis for how I ended up doing this work and leaving the church 12, 13 years ago now. Um, but even then, it was these layers of kind of undoing it in part, layer by layer, but there was still a pretty fundamental core of it. So originally, I thought the desire was priest, marriage, but eventually those desires have turned to be, I think, more to be of spiritual support and the path of love, really. So there was like, first I thought, oh, I'm asserting my autonomy by leaving this religious order thing, and now I'm going to go be a priest and be married, and that was what I wanted. And then then I ended up leaving the church altogether, and so it's been years and years of unwinding. What were these desires really about? And and then particularly sort of my late 20s, but more sort of into my 30s and mid 30s, was a recognition that at some point, kind of to my horror, all of these things, even with the best of intentions and even with the best of good desire and effort and commitment and practice and everything, there was still a way that what was really fundamentally pulling the strings was my survival system. And that was a hard thing to face,
Yeah.
to both acknowledge in an honorable way, like allowed me to survive. And I had a really interesting path full of a lot of amazing beauty and experience that a lot of people don't necessarily have. Also, a lot of really deep suffering. Um, just kind of a little, grab bag of the whole thing. But it was a tough moment to really look at that as clear-eyed as possible and really see, oh wow, like it's still pretty deeply for all that it appeared that I was on this great journey of vocation discernment and made these wild, epic changes in my life and moved places and lived all over the world. And it was all still the same thing, really. Um, and then when I started to peel back that layer, and this is where I ended up studying somatic work and trauma work and those kinds of processes, is there was a there was quite a lot of emotion that had been suppressed
Yeah.
around all of that under the guise of being good and holy and
Yeah.
all the rest. Um, so there's
Before
a lot of
we,
rage. Oh yeah, please
I just
pause
want
me.
to pause you only just to share this part, which is something that it's come to be like a beloved sort of facet of my friendship with you. And that is that because Chris was a pastor and a lot of people come to you for confession. And one of the things you'll find, and many of the people that have worked with Chris will recognize this, is that Chris holds this space where it's like, it seems to me like you've heard every single desire or fear or worry that a person could possibly have about like, am I worthy of God's love? Or am I worthy of belonging when I have these really challenging desires or this experience of my unworthiness or, whatever it is for the amount of time that you've been working with people in a space of representing, like, help me make this right within myself. Please be the one that brings order and leadership and some sort of, removal of the pain in such way that allows me to come back to myself, come back to my heart, come back to my belonging to the family of all things. And I feel like sometimes that body of that experience and that wisdom that you have, where it feels like I can tell you anything. And I know that everybody that has worked with you has said the same thing. It's like, I can tell Chris anything. And so I really want to highlight that part just because it truly has been such a miraculous part of the times when I've been able to work with you, as well as like co-working with you, is this place of like nothing shakes you, nothing is too strange,
Mm,
nothing is um, in any way dark or seems to be beyond your ability to have so much compassion and sweet attunement to the disruption that's happening within that person's heart or their being. And it's really really kind of neat because I've been working with people in a different way, very close for a long time, but I didn't really start coaching people in soul work until about 4 or 5 years ago. But that's something you've been doing for a long time, is this conversation about soul, about body, about what that truly means, and looking at it from, a multitude of angles. So yeah, just like it's a remarkable life path that you've had that's brought you into this. And yeah, I wanted to highlight that part. But then some of the repression side of it, like that experience too, like you were saying, of like, I like women to hear the side of men's experience too, of like that you're valued only for the externalization of like being a good man looks, and these are the gold stars or the check marks you get. And if you don't follow these, then you don't belong to this like man code, and how that can lead to like whatever comes up impulsively within you that needs to be stuffed down, or else you're not part of this like good man culture. And for a woman, we similar story, right? Like it's like impulses come through our body. This makes you a bad girl, or this makes you something that is in some way culturally not appropriate. In a woman's experience, and I'd love to know if this is the same case for a man's experience in your the way that you would articulate it, is it's like I just need to cut myself off from that feeling or that impulse, or I need to harden myself against it, or I need to bury it all together in some way where I act like it's not there. And then, as we all know, and you and I have experienced this lots in working with people, and I would say in my life for sure, it comes out sideways. It finds a way out, whether that's in a health crisis or in a relationship crisis or some sort of like resistance to seeing what's actually happening right in front of us, because we're not able to deeply listen. We've abandoned our deep longings so much so that they then start to reveal themselves in other ways. So yeah, you were starting to have dreams in your 30s, and those dreams were telling you that it was time to start going in a different direction. Is that how it went?
Yeah, but and we'll go there in a sec, but I just want to thank you for saying what you said about them. That's the best part for all the challenges and the
Right.
parts that were entwined and entangled with codependency and self-sacrifice and self-abandonment. The sort of pristine or sort of gems, one of them that's really important to me is grace and really a deep sense of mercy, which um, I think is genuinely reflective of the best of that tradition that I was raised in for all my disagreements with, and there are plenty with all the other sides, and those are still valid. I do want to honor from that lineage. That's a part that I think is really genuine to that tradition as best as I could live it out still in my life. It's still really important to me. And I'm still wearing black, so I still got the. I don't have the hoodie on today. Usually I got the monk look. I usually have my hoodie going, but at least I still got the. Still wearing my black. So yeah, so the dreams was kind of early 30s, and that was sort of a doorway or sort of crossroads kind of experience of do you want to take all this skill that you thought was going to be for the church world and then go outside of it and then still bring those gifts and talents and desire, but outside the walls of what you had assumed would be the way to do this. And so I ended up trying that out and still trying it out 13 years later, I guess. Um, and then the repression side that you were talking about and that we were starting to go to was, I would say, kind of a layer even beyond those experiences. So, kind of more mid 30s as I was transitioning out of the church and thinking, okay, finally, I've made the big decision. There was this whole complicated thing from my youth of like, I want to be a priest, but I want to get married and have a family and I want to fall in love. And that was the big supposed crisis. And then I had both of those, and then that didn't really fundamentally solve it on some level. Okay, well, it's the church thing, and it's so now I can be free spiritually, and that didn't actually it layers of it, sure, but there was still a kind of Procrustean bed or whatever of like a core kernel of it that was still really fundamentally untouched. And that was the really hard one to look at. But for all those years of major life changes and wild swings seemingly from the outside, there was still, like I said, this kind of unconscious energy that was puppeteering from the shadows. And that was that I was scared of being abandoned, just to be real, because understandably so, or that I was going to get sent back if I was going to use kid language, if I wasn't good. So it was hard to see without falling into a kind of a shame vortex. There's a real balance point, and there were moments that really felt like, oh, there's the event horizon for the black hole. Like, if I cross that line, I'm gonna get sucked right in. Um, to be able to see that the survival style is still fundamentally replicating the theme of abandonment, and I was abandoning myself. Um, that was a really tough pill to swallow. That was very unpleasant tasting medicine, but an important one too. There was no spoonful of sugar to help that medicine go down. That one was just bitter all the way down, but importantly so. And so as I began to slowly pull back that layer, as I was saying, that's when there were edges of it that had been touched into before, but there was a whole other level of rage, grief, shame, jealousy, disgust, trying to fear, terror, that the somatic work was there to create enough of a container so that when those things came forward, they didn't rock my world to the point that I couldn't handle it. Like it was going to shake, and it shook. But to be able to really stay like, I can stay steady with this. I can be bigger than this. There's enough space for this. And if there wasn't, then time out, and which is a lot of, what we teach with people, not just conceptually, but in embodied way. And then, so there was a period of that, all that kind of emotion that had been, as you said, stuffed down and had kind of been kind of rattling the cage from the basement or whatever for all those years. As that started to kind of purify and cleanse through and transmute, there was another phase that I was, in some ways, I think, even more shocked by and was even potentially at first more difficult for me, which was what about all the goodness and genuine human needs and genuine human connection that also got numbed out when that whole area, when the shutdown came in, it shut everything off. It was like, this is too painful. There's too much suffering here. We're just shut this whole thing down. It wasn't like, oh, well, we need to keep these parts because they're important and we're going to shut this part down because it's too painful. No, it was just a full on, we're just shutting this thing down altogether. So there was one phase of what people would usually call the hurt, kind of the pain, the tender emotion, the rage, the grief, that kind of thing. But then there was this whole like the return of feeling to needs and longing. And that was just as, if not in some ways, even more intense or tender or pathos filled. Um, do you want me to pause there? It seems like you
Yeah.
might have. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the analogy that I use sometimes on this one is like when you're sitting on your hip and your leg goes numb because you're sitting on your hip a certain way, and then you move and you realize that your whole leg is numb, and it starts to have sensation in it again, and it's not good sensation. Like there's like a big part of it that's like, I just wanted to go back numb again. This is so intense. It's such a strong feeling when it starts to re-innervate is what it is. And I like to tell this story, and I'm so glad that you're including this part of this beautiful share. And thank you for your vulnerability in this, because I want people to understand like that is such a common thing is like when you're rewarded with doing the courageous part, which is like, I'm going to start feeling my needs and I'm going to start feeling my feelings and I'm going to start tending and befriending some of these elements of my desire. It's not like it's not like what you would hope that it would feel like, right? Where you're just like, I'm so courageous and ennobled by this moment. It's like, oh, what is in here? This is terrifying. And I really find that it can be helpful to share that for people to understand that when we do start to do this brave work of like asking ourselves, what is this deeply tender, part of my experience where I got abandoned, or there's this like this this fear wall, and then there's also a life force on the other side of the fear wall, and you can kind of hear the life force on the other side of the fear wall, but the fear wall is so intense. And then maybe you're able to get to a point where you work with the fear wall enough and develop the capacity to start moving it, and that's what we teach and what we support people with. But then the thing that comes rushing through on the other side is like this geyser or this wall that has been dammed of it, all of this emotion, all of these energies of the astral body and the emotional body. And it is beautiful, beautiful work to do, as well as can be so intensely painful at moments. And so yeah, it's a great gratitude of mine that you are willing to go first. So often we're conditioned not to. We're conditioned not to feel these really alive feelings. So yeah, thank you for sharing them.
Yeah. And so it was at that point that I was starting to study in a specific kind of transformational energy modality. And one of the key things, and this is what kind of poked this next layer, was that it was all dependent on, and this was really a new experience for me, clarifying my own intentions. In order to do any of the processes, it was always, what do you want to work on? Where do you want to go? What do you want to experience? How would you like this to be different? What do you want to feel? How would you like to be in this? And I was so tongue-tied. I couldn't answer. I blah blah blah, or I get just but I don't know, because I had been so entrained that the only point of my will was to surrender it. So this idea that I had all kinds of conditioning that told me that that was egocentric, that that was selfish, that was regressive. I was regressing, um, and I felt pretty incapable and inadequate and wonky and awkward and like a little baby deer, all kind of the legs are all kind of wonky at first and stumble around. As I was like trying to find my footing and trying to find my articulation. And it's still a work in progress, honestly, but it's much further along than it was back at that point to be able to find voice, to be able to turn these feelings and be able to name what they are and then clarify them into an intention and then use that to go, okay, well, I kind of see myself here and I kind of see where I'm looking for kind of more over there. And now there's a gap. And what's the kind of stuff I'm doing currently that makes me feel like I'm moving closer to my goal? What are the kind of things that are diverting me and creating unnecessary obstruction or interference? All of those questions were not, those further follow-up questions were never questions that were really asked, because the first question was just like, where do you want to go with this? How do you want this to be? How do you want to be in this? What are you looking to have happen here? And that was never a question that was really fundamentally asked of me on any level, truly. Here or there, maybe, what do I want to study in school, or kind of career path do I want? And but when it came to these levels of like human connection, connection to myself, connection to others, connection to life, I was so attuned to everybody else's needs. I was so attuned to everyone else's desires. I was connected to God, the universe, all life. But there's an old CC Creedence Clearwater song where he says, "I wrote a song for everyone, but I couldn't talk to you." And it's kind of like that, but to myself. I could be connected to God, the universe, pretty much anybody, and hear anybody's stories more or less. And I didn't know what was going on in my own being. And that was a tender process, a very important and powerful one, and still ongoing. And again, in terms of the arc of this work, really crucial. Not everybody needs to have been in a religious order and have vows of celibacy or whatever, like I did. That's a bit of a weird uh, side note in this version of the story, but that arc of being asked, what would you like to have happen? How would you like to have agency in this situation? Where would you like to go with this? How do you want to develop deeper intimacy with yourself? And then people are sort of stunned and not have a clear answer. That's not, that's a pervasive and rampant thing. Even if the entryways and the doorways and how it looked and how the specific forms of that disconnect took place are quite radically different than my path in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Um, how far along in your timeline do you feel like that kind of like initial impulse started to come up for you? Like roughly what age do you think you were?
Well, I mean, I think in many ways it was always there,
Right.
and it was just all these layers of social norming, in my case, of what was allowed and what was not allowed, um, and then subtler ways that I thought that I had left it, as I was saying, in various stages, but it turned out maybe sort of the outer covering had changed a little bit, but the core of it really hadn't.
Yeah.
So. That was becoming a dad was a big part of that, and seeing, for example, my eldest daughter like being attuned to properly by her mom, which was really, of course, what I wanted for her, and very loving and sweet on a lot of levels, but also really painful for me to witness.
Yeah.
It gave it a whole other level of stuff that I had done a pretty good job of pushing pretty far down, that started to pull that governor off. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which love does in this really kind of cheeky way, I find, is like love can be so painful when you see, oh, this is so wonderful. Somebody I love is getting this thing that I never got. And you think, okay, that should feel in some way. It's easy to assume. They'd be like, all right, I broke the cycle. Or like, look at me go, I'm going past, even what I was afforded. And yet what it often does is like magnifies or highlights like, oh, there's still this experience here and it wants to come forward. And so, yeah, again, we see this place of trying to find like what needs are there and what needs, you know, finding a need is one thing. It's like almost this, shocking experience. You're like, I have a need here. And then, there might be shame connected to that or guilt connected to that. And so then it's like, but I also have to experience this part that it's fused with in some way. And then to move towards the agency side of meeting the need and speaking to the need is a whole other journey. And so I get why we live in a culture and a society where it's actually just easier not to. It's actually just easier not to feel that shame or feel that guilt or feel that deep hunger and that longing, and instead replace it with a multitude of other distractions in one way or another,
Yeah.
whatever those
Yeah.
distractions might be. Um,
Political ideologies, spiritual
yeah.
bypassing, forever being on a healing journey, that it
Yes.
forever being a healing journey and not an
Uh-huh.
expressive
Yeah.
or creative journey. Your usual secular version of somebody just out for money and glory and personal acquisition, whatever.
Yeah.
There's, like he's saying, 10,000 versions of the same basic thing, which is, do you want to just go the route of dissociation?
Right. Yeah.
That's really, and to understand dissociation as a survival strategy
Yeah.
and an understandable one. And yet, all survival strategies, like I said, in my own case, has a specific flavor, but a broader statement there is they all end up replicating the thing that was done.
Right.
So if someone was betrayed, they end up betraying themselves in the survival system. If there was abandonment, they're abandoning themselves. If there was a lack of truth and trust and there was deception, then they can easily deceive themselves and or others.
Yeah. Criticism
Not
becomes
even,
self-criticism.
of course.
Hatred becomes, yeah, self-hatred.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this path of, as you were saying, coming back to these genuine needs, one part was, as you said, sort of the wall of fear and the courage. And then another part of it that we work on a lot is that we're not looking for repression. We're also not looking for unconscious expression or things just overwhelming and the door swinging completely in the other direction either. Particularly if some of these genuine needs were suppressed at a very young age, and if they come back and they're young, as it were, in their expression, that doesn't mean they necessarily should be given the keys to the car. You don't want to give a 3-year-old the keys to the car. That's not the idea here. So we're not looking for a repression model, but we're also not looking for a just, oh, let it all, let it all out and just go with whatever. As opposed to the third option of container and then containment transfigures. And these energies that are rooted in fundamental benevolence transmute in the fire of love and consciousness and associated embodied awareness, not dissociative. I'm just the witness of the whole thing and I'm in the movie theater and life is just a movie on the screen, not that kind of thing, but really associative, close, textured, warm, embodied, feeling witnessing.
Well, and
It
then this
will,
other really cool thing that happens is like once you've got that part embodied, which you have, consistently demonstrated this, then all of that attunement to other that you needed to have as that adaptive strategy becomes part of the superpower of like from this place of my wholeness, I can deeply listen to another. And that thing that you teach people and that thing that you embody related to that gifting and that pain in your early part of your life becomes this like incredible gold, for others to be able to be around and to experience from you. And it's remarkable how well you attune to other. And I also wanted to highlight that space of like a big part of this teaching comes from that superpower you have of being able to read another person's body and being able to read the energetics of what's happening. And yeah, that comes from a life of working with it. So sorry, I had to cut you off there. It just really
no, you
felt like it
did.
was such an
Thank you.
important thing to name.
It is important. And to say that it's, that motto in my high school was a man for others. It should have been a man for self and others. It wasn't that that part was wrong as it was in the wrong order and it was imbalanced and it was leaving the other side of the equation out, which is to be able to attune to others but not lose ourself in the process. To be attuned to ourself first, like you said, in a sovereign way of our own wholeness, then to commune with each other from a space of our deeper individuation is a really beautiful thing. And that's what this intimacy is really all about is the more we become truly our individuated, sovereign, unique selves, the more we long to be with other people who are being their unique version and who enjoy our unique version and we enjoy their unique version. And then we're not in this game of competition because everybody's this radically singular, unique expression. So there's no comparison model. It becomes much more of this just like marvel and wonder and appreciation and ways that we can love and care for each other. And then in collaboration, everybody can slot into their zone of genius. And then all of a sudden, like the whole process can move, and that can be in relationships, that can be people who work together, that can be deeper friendship. So to me, that's where the attunement to self and attunement to other and the beauty of different relationality then can lead to the beauty of different forms of creativity and expression in this world that there's just so much wasted human creativity.
Yeah,
It's one of the most, to me, heartbreaking things to see.
yeah,
There's so much dream and capacity and talent and wonder and uniqueness and so much love in people that cultural forms and family script forms and institutional and bureaucratic and are just squashing that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
It is, yeah, it is heartbreaking to look at the thing that is our superpower, and that's our creative life force. Our sovereign creative life force is our superpower. It's only Chris has his superpower, only I have mine. Each person is the only one that can access it, and it is connected to this experience of our deep desires and our deep desires and deep longings, and how painful that journey into the truth of it can be, but then how miraculous and beautiful, and just the amount of unity, like you're saying, like unity without competition, where nobody needs to step on each other in order for us to have access to love and unlimitedness, because it's inherent in the way that we sing and work together. And yeah, quite a passion to bring forward now,
Mm.
would you say? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
That's good to go granular. And then it's good, sometimes really like say like, well, how does this relate to, people are always like, what about all the crises? And the thing is like, well, this is one way to approach it actually quite intentionally and thoughtfully and in a very conscientious way.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say is the biggest surprise about your recent, parts of your life where you've gone through these quite big challenges and journeys? What would you say is the thing that you never really saw coming?
Hmm, that's a great question. I I think I never. It's funny because it's one of these things where it was right on the tip of the nose, or it was always right there. But for whatever reason, I couldn't see it, which is just that, like, the purpose is actually just to be us and to love each other, to really sink into the singularity, the irreplaceable, truly uniqueness, which doesn't mean all of it's perfect. There's plenty of us that's foible and there's limitations and there can be shame and awkwardness and tenderness and sweet, hilarious, humorous, just humanity in the best sense. And the point of the exercise is actually to be that and to share that with each other. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I adore that you said that. And because so much of, the motivation when people come, whether they come to Chris and I and working together with us, or they come to me or to Chris, so often the question under the question is like, what's my purpose or what's the purpose of life? Like, why am I having the feeling that I'm having? And how does it not cohere with like what I believe is possible in some way or another? Like inherent is that is this tension that we're trying to figure out. And the answer is just so simple. And like you said, it's like it's right there. It's like just to be who we are, to love what we love, and to be able to have that experience. and and it just simply by doing that give a permission field for others to access that that's possible. One person role modeling that, one father role modeling that for his daughters, one mother role modeling that for her sons or daughters changes things vastly. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for asking me those lovely questions and thanks for giving me a space to speak.
Mm. I wonder if there's anything more that you want to share, like just in regards to some of the elements of survival energies and the transformation of survival energies into, you know, sounds simplistic, but it's actually something that follows what we're just saying is like there's a survival energy experience and then there's love. And they don't really compete with each other. It actually sometimes feels like they do, but those elements of whichever one comes forward, that there's this part of the human journey that's fascinating. And in the years that you've been working with stored survival energy or elements of people's experience and your experience with survival energy, is there anything else you want to share related to that part of transformation or transfiguration that feels really relevant?
But it's important to have an immense amount of compassion for our adaptive survival strategies. And I've been influenced by threads of work where they use that term specifically as a compassionate, more honoring way than language of self-defense mechanisms, certainly, which was the original language in the therapeutic tradition. And then later there was self-protection, which was a little more compassionate and empathetic, certainly, than self-defense, but still has a kind of an undertone or a sort of connotation of like, well, you're just protecting yourself. And to really honor them as adaptations as the best choice, the only choice that was possible under the circumstances. And yes, they come with major downside cost. They are they are limited, they are intrinsically limited. But to be able to try to see that more as a operating system as much as possible and have an honoring for what it achieves, because there are people, sadly, we know who don't survive. Um, just truthfully.
Yeah.
And So to honor survival, but then also to have in a very sober way the calculate the cost of this is the consequence of not that the survival energy is a villain or the slagging of the ego thing or any of that, but just like there's the system that was necessary. It came into being. I have survived. And yet, here is the cost of continuing along by unconsciously letting this thing run the show. Because survival energies are supposed to be short-term emergency protocol measures. And when they do that and then they can turn off afterwards, they are a real godsend. That's their wisdom, that's their intelligence, that's how we're all here as a species. As a long-term form of identity and as a chronic mode of disposition and way of being, they are not set up to achieve positive results. And we can see that on individual levels. You can see that on intergenerational families, groups. You can look at the various metasystemic crises that our species is currently operating under as a kind of species wide consequence of still living in survival energy. So the ramifications kind of at a fractal, you can look at it at any level you want. And it's this fascinating combination of both really deep compassion and appreciation and honoring for the survival, but also a really clear-eyed, sober, the consequence of still letting this thing play out is no bueno.
Yeah. 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 I have a question that's actually two questions, and I'm gonna just try to, I haven't quite compiled how I'm gonna ask you it, but it has to do with the perspective in speaking to the audience that are men, and then, you know,
Hmm.
conversely to women. And, with the body of knowledge that you have and all of the years of teaching and working with people in this realm specifically, really, these like heart-centered deep longings, and then the survival nervous system, the elements of what that does. If the audience was just men, what would you want them to understand?
Well, certainly when I talked about boy code, man code stuff, that's I was raised in a North American culture, so-called Western culture, increasingly. So it doesn't apply specifically across the whole board, although there are plenty of versions of it that are pretty similar the world over with some slight tweaks here or there. I'd say there's some pretty core elements that replicate, um, but at least just to try to place myself contextually. Um, I think if I was speaking really, really broadly, as I mentioned, the messaging of um, values outside of oneself, whether that outside of oneself is power and glory and riches and sexual conquests, or the outside of yourself is devoted, sacrificial, wonderful, good, kind person who does good for everybody, or whatever version. But so long as it's outside of oneself, so long as the worth or the value is considered external, no more amount of externality is going to touch the inner shame that is held about being told that your inner life doesn't matter, and it does. And again, speaking really, really broadly and stereotypically for a moment, if I may, I'd say the messaging for, at least in this cultural context, for men is that their value, their internal life generally isn't seen as important or valuable. All that matters is their external actions and whether they're achievement oriented, dependent on whatever the definition of what achievement is, the good end is in sight. Women's inner lives, uh, entire mega industries exist to tell them that their inner lives matter, but they need to only matter this way, but not that way, but also not this way, but not, but that way, but not that way, but kind of that way, but not that way, but sort of not that way, but then also not that way. And leading to anxiety, confusion, resentment, shutdown.
Yep.
In those cases, the inner life matters, but it's an inner life for other people to, in a non-consensual way, exploit, manipulate, and seek to control.
Yep.
I would say that generally the messaging I see is that men's inner life doesn't matter at all. Or to the degree that it does, it's only being stoked within certain current political movements in order to create foot soldiers for their political agenda, which is historically called fascism. You can just call it what it is, like this like return to real authentic masculinity and its society's become feminized. Like that's a version we can go back through history and that's not a new story that's being told. It's the same recycled thing over and over and over again. So it doesn't matter how many times you do awesome, you know, box breathing and how many awesome times you've done ayahuasca and how many cold plunges you've done, bro. Like to be like your best optimal self and you wake up at 5 and have your whatever, your power smoothie. Like
Yep.
there are just 10,000 versions of these that are the idea that here's what the correct man prototype is. And they're different versions of what the prototype is, but it's all the same version of templating and prototyping. And my message would be like, you decide who you want to be. You actually get in touch with your feelings. And if there's been so much of a life of being outside of oneself in order to seek worth or validation by whatever means, the journey inward needs to be really safe and held and tender because it's actually, we're all tender beings here,
Yep.
boys and men included. For all the stories of that's not the case. In fact, it is the case.
Yep.
Um, and so that will be usually a little bit challenging, but it's worth, with the right support, it's worth the journey.
Yeah. Thank you.
Did I answer your
So
question? Did I
good.
answer both your
Yeah.
questions?
Well, actually, I would say the version for the woman side now is like in
Mm,
this body of knowledge, I've been working with people around their very tender hearts' desires around intimacy and elements of
mhm.
their journey. And as a man, I wouldn't say on behalf of all men, but just kind of speaking from that voice of as a woman, I don't have access to this. But what would you like to communicate to women that they could understand about this journey from the perspective of a man?
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot there. I don't know if I can get it in a succinct, short amount of time. Um, I think a lot of men are just really confused about what they're doing here because the messaging is so mixed, which is on the one hand, particularly to the degree that it's more like traditional systems or kind of like very conservative versions or religious versions like I grew up in, for example. Those are trying to rebound by really saying like, men, you're all confused. We got the plan for you. Here's your 10-step program to be the good man. And again, they'll argue with each other about what exactly the 10 steps are, but they're not arguing over that's how you do it. It's just the return to the old code of your values only outside of yourself. And so here's the script, and here's the 10 commandments, or the 10 steps, or the 7 steps of highly successful people, or here's the things about how you have to clean up your room, whatever. They're all the versions of the same thing with slight disagreements with each other as to the surface content. Um, that's one message. And then the other message is a series of messages of like how awful all of that was, but have tended to conflate that with men as such. So that's the so-called toxic masculinity conversation. which now sometimes people can't even hear the word masculinity anymore without hearing toxic associated with it, which is profoundly shameful and deeply dehumanizing, and tends to leave this very bifurcated culture gender war thing going on where either the message is you're a toxic man and you better not be toxic, or the other group is basically like, okay, if you've been spending the last however long telling us we're all toxic, fine, we'll take it. We're toxic. We're coming for you. And that's a really dark and scary and icky, worrisome thing. So the idea here is to try to say, rather than having this like template of what's the good and true and authentic man that's always outside of themselves, like why don't these men get to co-create it for themselves? That is true to their being, that is true to their desires, is true to their own impulses and wisdom and unique expression of the force of life. And it can have lots of diversity that way. It doesn't have to look uniform. Um, But I see a lot of men just basically kind of bewildered and betwixt and between, just kind of in a kind of stunned middle space where they don't want to go down that yucky, icky road. They're not enjoying being criticized. They're not, so they get like tempted to this, like, come over to the dark side. Like it'll have a temptation to it because at least then it'll say, like, men are good. Here's the ways you can be a good man. And da, 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 and we love you and appreciate you. Like, for the purposes of exploiting you and using you as a pawn in their war, but they leave that part out, but that's there. And so I see a lot of guys just kind of stuck in the middle, just a little frozen and like, I don't want to do because that fundamental mixed messaging, neither side of that messaging is helpful. It's one thing to have deconstructed the problematic, undoubtedly, aspects associated with the history, no doubt about it. But if it doesn't have an ability then to move beyond deconstruction into a space of envisioning a constructive, creative, sovereign expression going forward, it just leaves people either with you got the old system or you have this unconfused, fragmented deconstruction space. And neither of those are particularly helpful in my view. How's that for attempting to be short and
Well,
sweet?
I feel like I'm still hungry for the side of like, as a woman, what is it that
Mm,
we don't see for the way that masculine,
yeah.
toxic or otherwise, actually would like to orient their energy to women in particular?
I think part of it is they don't know yet.
Mm.
I think part of it is for me, this again, we're speaking in really broad terms here, but like I would say men need to come home to themselves first
Yeah.
and not have some template imposed upon them. And whatever that template is, whether it looks like so-called good man or conservative or trad husband or whatever, or a return to go be rich and just, build up your own ego or whatever. Like there's poetry in those guys' hearts. There's like creativity, there's movement, there's longing, there's hurt, there's foibles, there's rage, there's a whole zone of experience to be transfigured. And only then potentially to start to hear what are the true generative desires that have not been essentially either incepted or that they're reacting against that inception. And so this experience of lostness sometimes is the message rather than like, oh, well, what is that pointing to about like maybe that actually that feeling of confusion and lostness is the first step to just recognizing that this whole overlay isn't actually working to get in touch with what is genuine in their being. Until they come home to themselves, how are they going to know? And how are they going to know that it isn't just another version of somebody else's story that's more slickly packaged to tell them how they can validate their being through external achievement.
In getting, without suggesting that it's like you've perfected it or anything, but like in getting
By
to
no
the
means.
space,
God, no.
yeah,
There's no way.
but in getting to the space where you're like, have learned
Mm.
those elements of prioritizing, wait, what does Chris need in this moment? Or what are Chris's desires? Or what is it that Chris is experiencing in his own intimate journey? Would you say that that's shifted the way that you orient to women now as a result of it?
Well, I mean, my life is an interesting one, given that I've spent a lot of my life mostly around women. We're just talking about men, and I have plenty of experiences with that too, but it's not that I ever said in this work, I'm only going to be working with women. It's just given the cultural norms that were just named, the default system is going to be 80 or 90% women most of the time. Um, I worked in a church for years, heavily much more women and female than male, even when it was a church that officially the men are the only ones who can hold the leadership position. But like who actually is there and who runs the thing is basically women mostly. So all of my cousins and all girls basically, like so. And then the years where I was celibate, because I wasn't on the market and because I wasn't seen as a like trying to come at women for sexual energies or hitting on or whatever, they started bringing what I called shields down. And then I recognized, like, oh my God, there's a whole other world there. And again, I wasn't raised with a machismo thing of like women are just there to be for your conquest. I don't want to. It was more like chivalry, damsel in distress, give your heart to the, chase love of the, uphold this beautiful ideal of this, romantic vision, which is great and all, except women are actual beings. And they're not pedestals. They're not beings who only exist in the ether. They're humans who have, their own desires, ideas, visions, experiences, places of hurt, places of glory, places of power, places of weakness, like anybody else. Um, so for me, that was the beginning of a whole long arc of recognizing there were galaxies and worlds, as I would say, behind a woman's eyes. And the change has been, which is a significant part of the nature of this teaching, is how to hold this witnessing space and how to hold a space of really deep devotion and beholding without then an agenda for that to be chivalry or knight or however, or conquest or get something out of it, and really cleanse at a deep level any unconscious, sticky desires. So it's actually like to be radically, genuinely, as deeply as humanly possible, profoundly present to adoration. And then to watch them, if they feel safe within that space, to then start to melt internally and to be this kind of space holding, pervading, radical presence of embodied love and care without an agenda other than deepening love and connection. And then if that becomes beautiful friendship, or that becomes collaboration, or that becomes lovers and chosen family, or combinations thereof, wonderful. But it really is just a fundamentally different way of returning to what those old polarity teachings I think we're trying to get at, but not in a particularly helpful way because they made it too static and again too controlled, is like the essence of the yang or the masculine is to be external. Yes, that's this whole story of the men have been all taught to be outside of themselves. There's a kind of energetic reason for why there's a susceptibility or vulnerability there, but in a way of not losing oneself, to stay internally anchored and then to be not coming out this way with agenda and force and pressure, but to become external while not losing oneself and to become like slowly and enveloping and all embracing. And then just to stay there and marvel and watch what happens. That's that's changed.
Yeah.
And that does interestingly draw on all of my spiritual training and all
Mm.
of these things. And now it's, liberated from the way it was controlled. But yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's a frequency that you hold with a remarkable amount of valor. And the body of work that you have of just being that safe space for so many women, you can tell when I get to work with you in person, and still translates when we work together online. But that's why I want it. That's why so often, whenever I'm working with women and they're like, "Can you teach my husband this stuff?" I'm like, "No, but Chris can." I can speak to it, and I understand the deep hunger that I have as a woman to have that like pristine energy where there's the polarity in a really healthy way. And polarity is a conversation with masculine and feminine is just fraught with confusion. So it's really nice to take it into this realm of like, well, if we just go yang and the primal essence of this energy and yin, and we look at those primal forces, and then we start to recognize like the really beautiful tension that can be there. It's true. If it's clear and safe, those armoring defenses go down, and every single one of us, like we actually all do want to shed our armor around our heart. Every one of us actually does want to be able to, at some point move when it's wise to do so, and when there's authentic safety to do so, and when you really have yourself centered in this place where you can move towards that shedding of the armor is, yeah, truly the most magnificent experience there is. So such a treat to be able to help people and walk in that way and to journey this path with you, Chris. I just have such an immense
Mhm.
respect and trust in you as a person that I adore. So grateful to get to work with
Mhm.
you and help people in this way. And thank you so much for just vulnerably sharing all of these parts of your life.
Thank you for asking me such lovely questions and listening and yeah, and being so kind and generous. And I too, it's such a great, amazing honor to get to work with you and share space and work with these beautiful beings who we're just all trying to be our tender yet powerful selves in this world. Yeah.
But I wanted to be kind because in the next episode, you're going to trigger me.
So you're gonna be in the hot seat. Yeah, I'll be kind. Yeah, that's exactly right. Good. That was wise. That was a wise move.
Thanks so much. Okay, looking forward to
Thank
it.
you.
Talk soon.